Picture this. You walk into a doctor's office for what should be one of the most vulnerable yet safe moments of your life. The person in the white coat greets you warmly. Someone backed by one of the most prestigious medical schools in the country. You trust him. You let your guard down. And then, he crosses a line so unthinkable, it destroys not just your trust, but the lives of countless women who came before and after you. This isn't fiction. This is a real story of Dr. Robert Hadden, the doctor who preyed on his own patients for decades, while the very institutions meant to stop him looked the other way. Hello everyone. Welcome to the Serial Crime Chronicles for newcomers to this channel. If you love true stories, this channel was made for you. We post true crime stories they thought they buried every day. If this interests you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you always get the latest content. Your support means a lot. Don't forget to hit the like button. As I've told you before, the like button is a simple gesture for you, but for me it's something huge because it helps YouTube know that people like my content and shows it to more new people. So please don't forget to support me by hitting that like button. In this true crime series, we'll journey through the rise and fall of Hadden. We'll uncover how he built his career, how red flags were ignored, how survivors found their voices, and how justice, though delayed, finally came. By the end, you'll understand not just a crime, but the systemic failures that allowed it to continue for so long. This story isn't just about one man. It's about the courage of women who refuse to stay silent. Our story begins in New York City in the 1990s. The bustling city is known for many things: Wall Street, Broadway, skyscrapers, but it's also home to some of the nation's most powerful hospitals and medical schools. Columbia University and its affiliate, NewYork-Presbyterian Hospital, stood as symbols of prestige. To train there, to work there, was to be part of the medical elite. For patients, it meant access to cutting-edge care. For doctors, it meant authority, status, and power. And into this world walked Robert Hadden. Hadden wasn't flashy. He wasn't the type of doctor you'd see on magazine covers or news headlines. Instead, he came across as mild-mannered, quiet, even bookish. Colleagues described him as reserved, someone who blended into the background. Patients often recalled how he seemed calm, soft-spoken, the kind of demeanor that reassured nervous women coming in for sensitive exams. On paper, he was the kind of doctor you'd want, intelligent, attentive, with a prestigious role in a respected institution. But behind the closed door of his exam room, something darker was unfolding. To understand this story, we have to understand not just Hadden, but the women whose lives he shattered. Many of them were young mothers, students, or women seeking routine gynecological care. They were often vulnerable, newly pregnant, anxious about their health, or unsure of what to expect in an exam. One of those women, who would later become a key figure in this case, described how she walked into Hadden's office for a prenatal appointment. She expected routine medical care. Instead, she left shaken, questioning what had just happened to her. She would later realize she wasn't alone. There were dozens of women. Eventually, it would be revealed there were hundreds, each with stories strikingly similar. Stories of exams that crossed lines, of inappropriate comments, of hands that lingered where they shouldn't. And then, there were the institutions. Columbia University, New York-Presbyterian Hospital. Both carried weight and influence in the medical world. Both would later face accusations of enabling Hadden, of allowing him to keep practicing despite multiple complaints. To fully grasp how Hadden got away with it for so long, you have to understand the culture of medicine at the time. In the 1990s and early 2000s, patients often deferred to doctors without question. A doctor's word carried authority, especially in gynecology, where many patients weren't sure what was normal or not during an exam. It was easy to second-guess themselves. Add to that the power dynamic, a patient in a vulnerable position, a doctor in control, and the setting of a prestigious hospital. Complaints could be brushed off as misunderstandings. Patients could be told they were exaggerating. And administrators could quietly move doctors around without ever addressing the underlying misconduct. This was the environment Robert Hadden operated in, and it was the environment that allowed him to continue unchecked. Though many women wouldn't speak publicly until years later, red flags started appearing early in his career. Some patients told family members immediately after leaving appointments that something felt wrong. Others confided in friends. Some even tried to report him, but their complaints rarely gained traction. One woman recalled how, after an exam, she felt violated in a way she couldn't even put into words. She sat in her car outside his office, crying, wondering if she had just imagined it. After all, he was a doctor. He was supposed to know best. But it wasn't just one woman. Over time, whispers started spreading. Nurses and staff noticed things that seemed off. Yet Hadden remained in his position. He was shielded by the institution's prestige and the assumption that a respected doctor couldn't possibly be doing something so vile. To keep up with this series and even more interesting true crime stories that never came to light until now, hit the red subscribe button. Now back to the story. What no one realized at the time was that Hadden wasn't just a doctor who crossed boundaries once or twice. He was a predator, and like many predators, he thrived in the shadows, relying on silence and shame to protect him. But silence doesn't last forever. By the early 2010s, the whispers became louder. Women who had carried their trauma for years began connecting with one another. Stories matched, patterns emerged, and finally, law enforcement started paying attention. The question now wasn't whether Hadden had abused his patients. The question was how many, how long, and how he had gotten away with it for decades. So, who was Dr. Robert Hadden really? How did a man in a white coat, backed by one of the most powerful hospitals in America, turn his exam room into a hunting ground? In the next part of this story, we'll pull back the curtain. We'll hear from survivors, uncover the first reports made against him, and explore how red flags were repeatedly ignored. Because the story of Robert Hadden isn't just about what one man did, it's about how an entire system allowed it to happen. Stay with us, because the deeper we go, the darker this story gets. Dr. Robert Hadden rose quietly within New York's medical elite, how he built trust with patients, and how whispers of misconduct started surfacing long before anyone truly listened. Now, in part 2, we dive into those early red flags, and how, for years, the system chose silence over accountability. It started small, at least on paper. In the early 2000s, hospital administrators received report from patients who described Hadden's exams as unusual, sometimes even frightening. One woman recalled how Hadden insisted she come to his office alone, discouraging her from bringing a friend or family member. Another said he lingered during her pelvic exam, making comments that were not only unprofessional but deeply unsettling. A few described him removing gloves during procedures, something that violates basic medical protocol. For most patients, these moments were confusing. Was it medical necessity? Was it just how doctors did things? Many didn't have the language to explain what had happened, but the feelings of violation were impossible to ignore. Some women tried to speak up. They went to nurses, administrators, even Columbia's patient relations office. But instead of being treated like survivors, they were treated like problems to be managed. Their complaints were often brushed off, minimized, or lost in paperwork. Why wasn't action taken sooner? The answer lies in the culture of medicine at the time, and, frankly, the culture of institutions that protect their own. Columbia University's medical system was prestigious, powerful, and, in many ways, untouchable. To suggest that one of their own doctors might be a predator was more than inconvenient. It was a threat to the hospital's reputation. And so, complaints were investigated quietly, then shelved. Hadden was spoken to behind closed doors, but he kept his position. In many cases, the women who complained felt dismissed, as though they had misinterpreted what had happened. This dynamic, of women feeling powerless against a system designed to protect men in authority, will become a defining theme of the Hadden story. As years passed, the stories piled up. One patient said Hadden touched her in ways that felt inappropriate and unnecessary during a routine checkup. Another remembered how he made comments about her body that felt deeply personal, even sexual. A third recalled how he told her she didn't need a nurse present in the room, insisting he preferred to examine patients alone. Again and again, the same pattern appeared: isolation, inappropriate comments, unnecessary touching. For those who trusted him, the experience was confusing and humiliating. Some blamed themselves. Others tried to bury the memory. But slowly, a picture began to form. One of a doctor who wasn't just bending medical norms, but was systematically exploiting his patients. Despite the culture of silence, a few women refused to let the matter drop. In the late 2000s, one particularly determined patient went to the police after leaving Hadden's office shaken and convinced that what he had done was criminal. She described her experience in painful detail, explaining how Hadden had crossed lines that no doctor should ever cross. Her report triggered a police investigation. Detectives began to dig into Hadden's past, looking for other women with similar stories. What they found was shocking. She wasn't alone. In fact, she was one of many. By 2012, the evidence was mounting. Police had gathered enough information to confront Hadden directly. When investigators searched his office and questioned staff, they discovered a disturbing number of women who described inappropriate conduct. Each story echoed the others. Our exams that were unnecessarily invasive, or comments that blurred the line between medical and personal. Situations where Hadden seemed to manipulate patients' trust across boundaries. Detectives realized they weren't dealing with a one-time offender. They were dealing with a serial predator in a lab coat. So, what did Columbia University do during all of this? Instead of taking immediate and decisive action, the hospital seemed more concerned with damage control than accountability. Administrators quietly suspended Hadden, but not before years of damage had already been done. For many survivors, this felt like too little, too late. One nurse later recalled that whispers about Hadden had circulated for years, but no one in authority seemed willing to risk their own careers by speaking out. He wasn't just a doctor, he was part of a powerful institution. In 2012, Robert Hadden was finally arrested. The charges were serious, multiple counts of sexual abuse and misconduct. For the first time, survivors saw a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the system would finally hold him accountable. As news of his arrest spread, more women came forward. What began as a handful of complaints quickly ballooned into dozens. Each story added weight to the case, painting a damning picture of a doctor who had used his position of trust to prey on vulnerable patients for decades. But even with this mountain of testimony, justice would prove elusive. To keep up with this series and even more interesting true crime stories that never came to light until now, hit the red subscribe button. Now back to the story. Despite the arrest, prosecutors face a major challenge. Proving abuse in a medical setting isn't easy. Doctors are allowed to perform intimate exams. They are allowed to touch patients in ways that, outside the exam room, would be considered assault. The defense would argue that Hadden's actions were medical, not criminal, and so began a long legal battle, one that would expose not only Hadden's crimes but also the failures of the system around him. By the end of 2012, Robert Hadden was no longer just a doctor. He was a criminal defendant, accused of abusing the very patients who had trusted him most. But as the case unfolded, the public would soon learn that catching him was only half the battle. We'll step inside the investigation itself. We'll see how detectives piece together survivor testimony, how prosecutors struggled to build a case, and how a shocking twist in court left survivors stunned and betrayed. Because if you thought arrest meant justice, the story of Robert Hadden will prove otherwise. So far, we've uncovered the mounting red flags against Dr. Robert Hadden, the women brave enough to report him, and the 2012 arrest that promised justice at last. But an arrest is only the beginning. In part 3, we step inside the investigation, the painstaking work of detectives, the stories of survivors, and the cracks in the legal system that would soon leave everyone stunned. When Robert Hadden was arrested in 2012, detectives knew they had more than one victim. The first complaint had opened the floodgates. Within weeks, women began contacting investigators, each with stories strikingly similar to one another. Detectives created a timeline, mapping years of allegations across Hadden's career at Columbia University and NewYork-Presbyterian Hospital. Some incidents stretched back decades. One woman described an encounter from the late 1990s. Another recalled an appointment in the mid-2000s. All carried the same unsettling pattern: exams that were far more invasive than necessary, comments about patients' bodies, and a sense of powerlessness under the doctor's authority. What shocked investigators most was the consistency. Different women, different years, different circumstances, but the same script. By 2013, detectives had spoken to more than 18 women willing to testify. Some described routine checkups that turned into nightmare experiences. Others recalled being young and vulnerable, college students, new mothers, or women dealing with complex pregnancies. One survivor remembered how Hadden insisted she remove more clothing than necessary for a simple exam. Another said he performed repeated, invasive procedures without explanation. Some recounted how he discouraged the presence of chaperones, preferring to be alone with his patients. Each woman's testimony added another piece of the puzzle, and the picture was damning. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a cultural misstep. It was predation. For detectives, the task was clear: build a case strong enough to withstand the inevitable defense strategy that Hadden's actions were medical judgment, not criminal assault. Proving abuse in a medical setting is notoriously difficult. Doctors have unique authority to perform procedures that would otherwise be considered invasive or even criminal. A pelvic exam, by definition, is intimate. How do you prove when that intimacy crosses a line into assault? Prosecutors needed more than testimony. They needed evidence of intent, something to show Hadden wasn't just practicing medicine, but abusing his role deliberately. They combed through medical records, looking for irregularities. They examined hospital policies on chaperones and glove use. They studied how Hadden documented, or failed to document, certain procedures. But the evidence was mostly circumstantial. The real power lay in the voices of survivors, and prosecutors hoped that, together, their collective stories would make the truth undeniable. As the investigation unfolded, Columbia University and New York-Presbyterian Hospital found themselves under increasing scrutiny. How had a doctor with so many complaints been allowed to practice for so long? Hospital administrators claimed they had investigated prior concerns, but critics argued that those investigations were superficial at best, cover-ups at worst. Columbia eventually cut ties with Hadden, but only after his arrest. By then, the damage had already been done. For survivors, the hospital's role felt like betrayal. Not only had they been violated by their doctor, but they believed the institution had knowingly enabled him. By 2014, prosecutors felt they had enough. A grand jury indicted Robert Hadden on multiple felony charges: sexual abuse, forcible touching, and related crimes. The courtroom was set to become the battlefield where survivors would finally confront the man who had violated them. The indictment alone was a victory. For many women, it was validation that their voices mattered, that their pain had finally been recognized by the justice system. But the relief was short-lived. Hadden's defense team went on the offensive. They painted him as a respected doctor whose bedside manner was misunderstood. They argued that his actions, while perhaps unconventional, were always in the context of medical care. They pointed to the lack of physical evidence, claiming that the entire case rested on misinterpretations of routine gynecological practice. They questioned the credibility of survivors, hinting that their memories were unreliable or influenced by media coverage. It was a strategy designed not just to protect Hadden, but to sow doubt in the jury's mind. And in cases like these, even a little doubt can derail justice. Despite the defense's tactics, survivors were determined. Many agreed to testify in court, even though it meant reliving their trauma in front of strangers. One survivor later described the emotional toll. "I knew what he had done to me, but the idea of sitting in court, of being cross-examined, of having to prove my own violation, it was terrifying. Still, I couldn't stay silent." Their courage became the backbone of the prosecution's case. As news of the charges spread, the story drew public attention. Parents, women's health advocates, and survivors of medical abuse rallied around the case. Questions swirled about how many victims there really were. Some reports suggested dozens, others hinted at hundreds. For many New Yorkers, the case struck a nerve. If this could happen at Columbia, one of the nation's most prestigious institutions, what did that say about the safety of patients everywhere? By mid-2014, the trial of Dr. Robert Hadden seemed inevitable. Prosecutors had survivor testimony, a clear pattern of misconduct, and a community demanding justice. The courtroom was expected to become the stage for one of the most significant medical abuse cases in recent history. But then, something happened that no one expected. Instead of going to trial, prosecutors made a deal. The man accused of serial sexual abuse, backed by testimony from dozens of women, would not face a jury. He would not hear survivor after survivor take the stand. Instead, he struck a plea deal, one that would leave survivors shocked, outraged, and betrayed. We'll uncover the details of that deal. How did a case with so much evidence collapse into a slap on the wrist? And why did the justice system, once again, seemed to favor the predator over the prey. Stay with us, because the next chapter of this story is where outrage boils over. The walls of Columbia University's medical facilities once represented prestige and healing. But by the late 1990s and early 2000s, whispers about one of their doctors, Robert Hadden, were growing louder. Patients had begun to compare notes, and what had once felt like isolated discomforts were forming a pattern that could no longer be ignored. One woman, interviewed years later, recalled how she left Hadden's office confused and shaken. At first, she told herself maybe she was overreacting. After all, this was a doctor at one of the top hospitals in the country. Surely she misunderstood his methods. But when she met another patient who described nearly identical encounters, strange, touching, inappropriate questions, long exams that made no medical sense, the denial began to crumble. By the early 2000s, complaints quietly trickled in. A few women told nurses, some confided in friends, and others considered reporting to the hospital directly. But Columbia had a reputation for handling things internally. Patients feared they would not be believed, or worse, that their accusations would vanish into a system designed to protect the institution's image. To keep up with this series and even more interesting true crime stories that never came to light until now, hit the red subscribe button. Now back to the story. Hadden was charismatic, soft-spoken, and projected authority. That demeanor made it easy for administrators to believe his explanations and dismiss patient concerns. He claimed his methods were unconventional but medically necessary. And in an era where doctors were rarely questioned, especially in specialized fields like obstetrics and gynecology, many accepted his word. But behind closed doors, the number of women who shared eerily similar stories kept growing. They described exams where Hadden insisted on seeing them alone, locking the door, and stretching sessions far longer than normal. He asked graphic questions unrelated to their medical needs. And in some cases, patients reported outright sexual abuse disguised as medical care. What was supposed to be a place of safety had become a hunting ground. For years, the whispers remained just that, private exchanges of disbelief and shame. But in 2012, a patient finally decided enough was enough. She reported Hadden's behavior not only to Columbia but also to law enforcement. This moment would prove to be the first true crack in the fortress that had protected him for decades. The NYPD and Manhattan District Attorney's Office began looking into her allegations. Soon after, more women stepped forward. One by one, patients came forward with stories that mirrored one another almost perfectly. Investigators realized they were not dealing with misunderstandings or isolated incidents. This was a pattern of predation, stretching back years. Detectives began conducting interviews, often in quiet conference rooms where women recounted some of the most painful experiences of their lives. The stories were remarkably consistent: inappropriate touching, invasive questions, exams that served no medical purpose. Many victims described freezing in fear, unsure how to react to a doctor in a white coat who wielded authority and trust. The interviews painted a chilling picture. Robert Hadden wasn't just crossing boundaries. He had systematically exploited hundreds of patients under the guise of medical practice. As investigators pieced together evidence, another troubling question emerged. How much did Columbia University know? And when did they know it? It turned out that staff members had raised concerns about Hadden years earlier. There were whispers among nurses. There were complaints filed by patients. Yet, Columbia had not removed him. Instead, they quietly reassigned him, shuffled cases, or downplayed allegations. This pattern of protection would later become one of the most controversial aspects of the entire case. In 2014, Robert Hadden was finally arrested. Headlines spread across New York, shocking the public. How could a doctor at one of the nation's most respected institutions have gotten away with this for so long? But for the women who had suffered, the arrest was only the beginning. They wanted accountability. Not just for Hadden, but also for the powerful institution that had shielded him. The Manhattan DA initially charged Hadden with multiple counts of sexual abuse. But as the case wound through the courts, victims faced new frustrations. In 2016, prosecutors offered Hadden a plea deal that stunned many of his patients. He would avoid jail time, surrender his medical license, and register as a sex offender, but he would not spend a single day behind bars. For the women, it felt like betrayal layered on top of betrayal. First, Columbia had failed them. Now, The justice system was letting their abuser walk free. The plea deal, rather than silencing the victims, had the opposite effect. Outraged, many women began speaking publicly, sharing their stories in press conferences, documentaries, and court hearings. They describe how Hadden groomed them, manipulated trust, and violated them during what should have been routine medical exams. Their bravery brought national attention to the case, igniting outrage over how doctors accused of sexual abuse often protected by powerful institutions. By 2020, the pressure had grown too loud to ignore. Women who had once felt silence were now demanding accountability. Journalists investigated, advocacy groups rallied, and lawmakers called for action. The turning point came when federal prosecutors stepped in. Unlike the earlier state case, the federal investigation focused on whether Hadden had lured patients across state lines for the purpose of abuse. This opened the door for charges that carried far heavier consequences. The investigation was painstaking. Prosecutors reviewed medical records, interviewed dozens of victims, and combed through decades of complaints. They discovered that some patients had traveled from other states specifically to see Hadden, and prosecutors argued that he had used his role as a doctor to entice them. By 2020, federal agents arrested Hadden once again, this time under charges of enticing and transporting victims across state lines for sexual abuse. The stage is set for the most intense chapter yet. Dozens of women have found their voices. Columbia University is facing mounting pressure to explain how they let a predator practice for decades. And Robert Hadden, once untouchable, is now facing the way to the federal justice system. The investigation that began with one woman's courage has now grown into a battle for justice that could shake the foundations of medicine and accountability in America. The courtroom was packed. Rows of women, many of whom had never met each other before the trial, sat shoulder to shoulder, hands trembling, hearts pounding, waiting for their moment of acknowledgement. For years, their pain had been silenced, their experiences dismissed as exaggerations, misunderstandings, or even fabrications. But now, in the charged atmosphere of a New York courtroom, their truths were finally being spoken aloud. The emotional weight in that room was overwhelming. When prosecutors read aloud just a portion of the charges against Dr. Robert Hadden, sexual abuse of dozens of women under the guise of medical treatment, many victims wept openly. Others clenched their fists, determined not to let the man who had once held absolute power over them see their tears. The testimony was devastating. Women recounted in vivid, harrowing detail the exact moments when their trust in a doctor, supposed to be a healer, protector, and advocate, was shattered. They describe how Hadden often locked the examination room door, how he insisted nurses leave the room, how his hands lingered where they should not, and how he used a calm, professional tone to disguise the most intimate violations. One woman, trembling as she spoke, told the jury, "I remember thinking, this can't be right, but he's a doctor. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I don't understand. I didn't even tell my husband right away because I thought no one would believe me." Her words echoed the sentiments of countless others. The emotional climax of this case wasn't just about proving Hadden's guilt. It was about exposing how systemic failures allowed him to hurt women for decades without being stopped. The sheer courage it took for these women to come forward cannot be overstated. For many, testifying meant reliving their worst memories in public, facing cross-examination from defense attorneys determined to poke holes in their stories. But despite the fear, they stood tall. Their strength was the beating heart of this case. What was perhaps most striking was the consistency of the stories. Different women, from different backgrounds, who had seen Hadden across decades, 1980s, 1990s, 2000s, described the same behaviors, the same manipulations, the same chilling pattern. That pattern was impossible to ignore. Hadden had created an environment where women doubted themselves, where medical authority became a weapon. And it wasn't just the acts themselves, it was the aftermath. Many women described how, after appointments, they left the office in shock, confused, and ashamed. They questioned themselves. Did I overreact? Did I misunderstand? That internalized doubt was part of the damage. But if Robert Hadden was a man on trial, the Columbia University medical system loomed large as an unindicted co-conspirator in the minds of many. How could one doctor, over the course of 3 decades, abuse so many women without anyone noticing, or without anyone acting on what they noticed? Court documents revealed chilling details. Nurses had complained. Patients had complained. There were whispers in the hallways. And yet, Hadden remained. He wasn't fired. He wasn't investigated properly. In fact, in 2012, when he was first arrested on state charges, the plea deal he received shocked nearly everyone. Instead of serving time in prison, Hadden was allowed to surrender his medical license and walk free. No jail, no probation, just a quiet assurance that he could never practice medicine again. For survivors, that plea deal felt like a betrayal, proof that the system valued a doctor's career over women's safety. One victim said, through tears, "I trusted Columbia. I trusted the hospital. They let him hurt me, and then they let him walk away." As the trial progressed, the public began to ask the same haunting questions. How many women were there really? The federal charges covered dozens, but advocates believed the number could be in the hundreds. Every week, more women came forward with eerily similar stories. Who else knew? If nurses had complained, if administrators had been warned, how far up did that knowledge go? Was there a conscious effort to cover up Hadden's behavior to protect the hospital's reputation? Why did it take so long? Some women had been speaking out since the 1990s. Why did it take until the 2020s for real justice to even begin? These questions weren't just about Hadden. They were about trust in the medical system itself. In the U.S., where doctors hold immense power and authority, how do we ensure accountability? How do we protect patients who may already feel vulnerable and intimidated? The most dramatic moment of the trial came during the sentencing phase. Victims lined up one after another to deliver their impact statements directly to Hadden. For years, they had been silenced, doubted, minimized. Now, they looked him in the eye and spoke their truth. One woman said, "You robbed me of the ability to trust any doctor again. Every medical appointment since you has been trauma. But I'm here today because you don't get the final word. I do." Another declared, "You use your white coat as armor, but today, it's gone. You're not a doctor. You're just a predator." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of quiet sobbing and the scribble of pens from reporters. It was a moment of collective release, of reclaiming power. In 2023, Robert Hadden was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison for his crimes. The judge, in delivering the sentence, acknowledged the profound damage Hadden had inflicted, not just on individual women, but on the trust between patients and the medical system as a whole. But even in that moment of justice, there was pain. For some survivors, no sentence could undo the years of shame, fear, and doubt. For others, the focus shifted to Columbia University, which had settled lawsuits for $165 million with 147 of Hadden's former patients, the largest sexual abuse settlement involving a university in U.S. history. Still, questions lingered. Could more have been done to stop him earlier? Would the culture of silence in medicine truly change after this case? The Hadden case became a rallying cry for patient safety and accountability. Advocacy groups began pushing for strong protection for women in medical settings, including requiring chaperones during sensitive exams and creating independent reporting channels outside hospital administrations. It also became a stark reminder: predators don't always hide in dark alleys. Sometimes, they wear white coats, speak with calm voices, and smile reassuringly as they commit their crimes. For survivors, though, the emotional peak wasn't just about Hadden's downfall. It was about reclaiming their narratives. For years, their stories were dismissed. Now, there were front-page news, broadcast on national television, and etched into the legal record. And in that, there was power. What happens when the people we trust the most, our doctors, turn out to be predators hiding behind white coats? Tonight, we close a chapter on Dr. Robert Hadden, the disgraced Columbia University gynecologist whose decades-long abuse left a scar not just on his victims, but on the entire medical community. We'll walk through Hadden's sentencing, the impact statements that shook the courtroom, the public outrage that grew louder than ever, and the reforms that survivors fought tirelessly to bring about. But we'll also confront the uncomfortable question: even with Hadden behind bars, has justice truly been served? The courtroom in New York was tense in July 2023 when Robert Hadden, once a respected gynecologist, stood before a federal judge for sentencing. Prosecutors laid out the breadth of his crimes. More than 2 decades of preying on vulnerable women, using his position of trust to commit sexual abuse under the guise of medical care. Hadden had already faced scrutiny years earlier when Columbia University and New-York-Presbyterian quietly pushed him out after earlier complaints. But it wasn't until federal prosecutors built a case under charges of enticement to travel that the justice system finally cornered him. He had lured women from other states into his Manhattan office, where abuse occurred. The judge's word was sharp, echoing the outrage of the public. Hadden's crimes were heinous and monstrous, exploiting the sanctity of the doctor-patient relationship. The courtroom heard stories of women who had once entered Hadden's exam room trusting him with their health, only to leave scarred for life. In the end, Hadden was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. For many survivors, it was a long-awaited victory. For others, it felt far too little compared to the decades of harm he had inflicted. To keep up with this series and even more interesting true crime stories that never came to light until now, hit the red subscribe button. Now back to the story. One of the most powerful moments of sentencing came from the victims themselves. Dozens of women delivered impact statements, raw, unfiltered accounts of the betrayal they endured. Some spoke through tears, recalling the confusion they felt as young patients when Hadden crossed boundaries they didn't even realize were violations. Others spoke with fiery resolve, determined to expose him so no other woman would ever fall into his trap again. Their stories weren't just about the abuse. They were about the silence that followed, the years spent doubting themselves, the shame that kept them quiet, and the frustration of watching Columbia University avoid accountability. One survivor's words rang in the ears of everyone present. "He stole more than my trust. He stole my ability to believe that doctors were there to heal." Every exam room after him felt like a battlefield. These testimonies were not just about Robert Hadden. They were indictments of the system that allowed him to thrive for so long. Beyond Hadden, survivors and advocates turned their anger toward Columbia University and New-York-Presbyterian. Both institutions had received complaints about Hadden as early as the 1990s, yet instead of alerting authorities or protecting patients, administrators quietly forced him to resign in 2012 with what amounted to a soft landing. For years afterward, Columbia continued to benefit from its reputation, while survivors carried the weight of what had been done to them. Eventually, lawsuits mounted. Columbia agreed to pay more than $230 million in settlements to hundreds of women, the largest sexual abuse settlement ever paid by a university in U.S. history. But many argue that money could never replace accountability. No senior administrators faced charges. No public apologies from top leadership addressed how such widespread abuse had been swept under the rug. The case became a symbol of how powerful institutions often shield abusers instead of victims. The Robert Hadden scandal triggered more than outrage. It spurred reform. In New York, lawmakers introduced measures aimed at strengthening patient protections. These included clearer reporting mechanisms for misconduct, mandatory abuse prevention training, and a push to close legal loopholes that had previously allowed predators in medical fields to escape criminal consequences. Nationally, the case reignited conversations about trust in healthcare. How could patients, especially women, feel safe in exam rooms if institutions repeatedly failed to hold abusers accountable? Survivors formed advocacy groups, pressing for changes not only in law but in culture. They wanted future patients to know their voices would be heard immediately, without being dismissed or buried in bureaucracy. Yet even as Hadden began serving his prison sentence, questions lingered. Why had it taken so long for authorities to act, despite years of red flags? How many women had never come forward out of fear or shame? And perhaps the darkest question of all, how many other Dr. Haddens were still out there abusing patients under protection of silence and institutional power? For survivors, these questions weren't abstract. They were reminders of how close they had come to being silenced forever. Dr. Robert Hadden will likely spend the rest of his life behind bars, his name forever tied to one of the most egregious cases of medical abuse in modern American history. For some survivors, that is closure. For others, true justice will always remain elusive. What cannot be denied is that their voices, once ignored, are now impossible to silence. Their courage not only brought a predator to justice, but also exposed the cracks in a system meant to protect patients. And that's where the story leaves us, with a chilling reminder that evil can hide in plain sight, even in the offices of the people we trust most. but also with hope that by telling these stories, by demanding accountability, and by listening to survivors, we can build a system that will never again allow a predator like Robert Hadden to go unchecked. So now I'll turn the question to you. Was justice truly served in the Robert Hadden case, or did the system fail survivors far too long before catching up? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Like, comment, and subscribe to the Serial Crime Chronicles, where every crime has a witness, and every truth will be told, because here on this channel, we don't just tell stories. We uncover the truths that institutions would rather forget. See you in the next episode, and thanks for watching.